So we are your student anchors for today's lecture, and we are currently enrolled in the course German Women's Writing. We welcome you all on behalf of the Center for Foreign Languages to this online guest lecture series on German women's writing, which is being organized in collaboration with the German Academic Exchange Service. In the last lecture, our prestigious speaker, Dr. Meher Booth, talked about different waves of feminism and how that gave birth to the queer theory in the Anglo-American context, and how does gender fluidity is highlighted in the literature. Anushka, would you like to share some reflections from the last lecture?
Yeah, for sure. I think in the last lecture, the distinction between equity and equality stuck with me the most, and that's something I would like to delve deeper into. However, I was wondering, how did the concept of gender studies came into being in the German context? And I look forward to know more about it in today's lecture.
Very well put, Anushka, and I'm looking forward to see how it revolves around in the German context. As we all know that throughout history, women have often been targeted in wartime for violence, especially sexual violence. Conflict can result in higher levels of gender-based violence against women, including arbitrary killings, torture, sexual violence, and even forced marriage. In today's lecture, our prestigious speaker, Dr. Pallavi, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Foreign Languages in Tezpur University, Assam, will highlight women in conflicted situations, drawing from A Woman in Berlin, written by Martha Hillers, a diary which records the witnessed writings of violence which took place at the end of the Second World War when the Soviet soldiers advanced to the bombed out Berlin. Over to you, Anushka.
Yeah, thank you. On that note, I would like to invite our Professor Shruti Jain, who is a German associate professor at JGU and is the convener of this online lecture series. And she's also the course instructor for this course through the JGU Center for Foreign Languages. We invite her to make some opening remarks and are extremely pleased that she organized this lecture for us.
Thank you, Anushka. So good evening, a very, very warm good evening to all of you. Now, in the previous guest lecture, as Anushka and Kushagra said, which was delivered in the guest lecture delivered by Professor Meher Booth, last Monday, we embarked upon a journey through the 4 waves of feminism and the emergence of gender studies and queer studies in the international context. So today's talk and the upcoming talks will help us understand the trajectory of feminism and gender studies in the German-speaking countries and what concerns German women writers have voiced. In my introductory remarks, what I want to try to do is, also place today's novel in the history of German women's movement and in the context of German feminist movement and feminism, so to say. This is the time 1945. Of course, Pallavi is going to tell us exactly what happened. We will find out about it. But maybe it's interesting to see how it started, the story, her story started, and what all led to, so to say, the novel that is happening today, that we're talking about today. Of course, the present context is also very important. The relevance of the novel that we're going to discuss today, I mean, it is as great as it can be. The topic of rape, violence is very, very aktuell, as they say in German, right? So in their book, German Feminist Writings, I came across this book by Hermingshaus and Müller, 2001, in which they provide a deep insight into German feminist thinking over the past 250 years. It is important to note that the women's movement in Germany has been intertwined by the various political and historical turns in Germany, and has taken, and thus taken on a rather unique color of its own. It was through the efforts of women such as Luise Otto Peters, Helene Lang, Clara Zetkin, Hedwig Dohm, Anita Augsburg, among others, many, many others, that the German women finally attained the right to vote on the 12th of November, 1918. Marie Juckert, became the first German woman to deliver a speech at the Weimar National Assembly in 1919. So the first wave of feminism in Germany, which also coincides with the Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933, is marked by the attainment of women's right to vote. Now, during this time, one sees significant transition in the role of women from the confines of the household and childbearing to paid employment. Women seek jobs as secretaries, stenographers, receptionists, or actors. The gates of universities were now also open to women. The new woman, as they called her, this woman with the booby cup, short skirts, and an athletic body, now was seen on the streets of the cities, German cities. One speaks of the literary movement called Neue Sachlichkeit, or new objectivity, during this time. In our course, we took up the novel The Artificial Silk Girl by Irmgard Coyne, published in 1932, which is an excellent example of Neue Sachlichkeit. This is a novel where Doris, the protagonist, manipulates her sexuality to reach her dream of becoming an actress. This phase, however, was short-lived. After its initial successes and popularity at the beginning of the 20th century, feminism in Germany suffered a setback during the Nazi regime and the subsequent period. While we look back, now it's very interesting, when we look back at the history of women during and after the Nazi regime, we find that women's roles have been split into victims as well as perpetrators. So women were not just victims, but they were also perpetrators. I'll explain what I mean by that. So the Nazi propaganda, on the one hand, now if we say women as victim, the Nazi propaganda was able to successfully separate the roles of men and women in society again. Women were again pushed to the domain of the 3 Cs, the drei Ks, as they call it in German, the children, church, and cooking. They were encouraged to have as many children of pure Aryan blood as possible. The law of encouragement of marriage was passed, and the amendments were made in the divorce laws so that men could seek divorce if women aborted or were unable to bear children. The Honorable Mutterkreuz was bestowed upon women on every 12th of August. That was the birthday of Hitler's mother. The gold medal was given to women who had 8 children, silver to those who had 6, and women who had 4 children had to make do with the bronze medal. In her book, Birth, Sex, and Abuse, Women's Voices Under Nazi Rule, 2015, Beverly Chalmers describes the atrocities against women during the Nazi regime, including sterilization and extermination of women who did not match the brief of Aryan purity. Now, this is one side, right? And the other side, however, there is also a very important discourse on the SS, the female SS guards. Elisa Mailänder, in her book, Female SS Guards and Workaday Violence, 2015 again, describes how violence and instilling of fear became a social practice among female SS guards in the concentration camps. We hear of women such as Ilse Koch, who was called the Witch of Buchenwald, for instance, or Maria Mandl, who was called the Beast of Birkenau. Now, this is also there, but we have a third narrative, which was never really noticed. And while this discourse views the Nazi German women in a rather negative light, there is yet another discourse on German women that has only very recently caught the attention of scholars, namely the rape and violation of German women by the Red Army in 1945. It is this discourse that Dr. Pallavi will also help us understand better today. So I thank you, dear Pallavi, for agreeing to share the insights of your research with us. And I'm deeply indebted to Dr. JAN-HELGE WEIDEMANN to take up the responsibility of chairing this important session. Thank you all for joining us today. I now hand over the virtual mic to the student anchors. Back to you, Kushagra and Anushka.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for sharing your insights on the women's movement and its evolution in Germany and highlighting the women's contribution in the literature. But it does makes me really sad to know that, how women are always a victim of such atrocities and how vulnerable they get in conflicted situations. Anushka, would you like to say something about this?
I think during the wartime, because they're the most vulnerable, they're one of the vulnerable sections of society. They tend to get affected more. And during that, as Professor said, that women are not only victims, but perpetrators as well. So I think this situation brings out that side in them.
Very well said. So yeah, moving forward, we are extremely glad to have Dr. Jan-Helge Weidemann with us today. Dr. Weidemann will be chairing the session, and he joined the Department of Germanic and Romance Studies of the Delhi University as DAAD lecturer in August of 2020. Prior to that, until 2018, he had been teaching in Shanghai. He received his bachelor's degree from Jacobs University, Bremen, Germany, in History and Theory of Art and Literature, which he followed up with an MA in Film Studies at the University of Southampton in UK. He completed his PhD in Literature at Jacobs University in 2012, writing about the cinematic experience from the perspective of media and anthropology. So I would like to invite Dr. Weidemann to take the floor. Sir, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kushagra, for the very nice introduction. After everything that has already been said, I mean, the historic timeline has been discussed, the novel has been discussed. You actually already introduced PALLAVI. I don't want to get much in the way. The only thing that listening to what our two wonderful student anchors were saying, I would already point out there was this time after the biggest conflicts in human history, at least up till now, the First and the Second World Wars, namely, as Shruti mentioned, the women got the right to vote right after the First World War. And this is a relatively standard thing when you look at most Western powers. They all did it right after the war when the men did not return from the war, and you kind of just couldn't find a conceivable reason to exclude then really the majority of the population from the political process. When it comes to the aftermath of the Second World War, a lot could be said, but again, a generation of men was missing, and you still had many people that were then rearing children just without a partner, which meant that they also had to fight for themselves in the economic realm, which, I mean, that's also, I mean, maybe the most significant thing of it all, because the SS guards, they exist, but there are not that many. But the women in the workforce in the second half of the 40s and then throughout the 50s and onwards, once they were there, I mean, how do you tell the next generation, okay, your mother was in the workforce, but now you can't be in the workforce anymore? I mean, when you just do the math, you end up in 1968 for a very good reason, because it just, you can't put the toothpaste back into the tube once it is out. So, I mean, there is this, and I'm just saying this in response to the a little bit gloomy outlook from, of course, the horrible sufferings during times of crises, but very sadly and positively at the same time, something positive has developed out of it in the long run. And that is, of course, heartening. And I'm sure we will hear more about this today from PALLAVI. PALLAVI, I can't introduce you much more, but would you like to share with us maybe in one sentence your research interest? How did you get to this particular topic?
Oh, I'm done with my Dr. Right already. And
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, and I think when I was trying to figure out the topic of my research, it was way back 2012, 13, 14, after my MPhil. So that was the time when this Nirbhaya happened. And that is the, I would say, the trigger point which actually enabled me to read lots of stuff around it. And also, if you will observe society at large, then violence against women here in India is quite rampant, and different forms of violence. So yeah, that's what I can say. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And actually with that, I would say the floor is yours. Feel free to start your presentation. Everybody else, please keep your microphones off. I think I'll also switch off my video just in case, you know, that would be distracting. But PALLAVI, I'm here. If you need anything, you just say it and you'll get it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weidemann. So I would like to first extend my thanks to the Jindal Global University, DAAD, and also thinking about this, platform and specifically this topic, and giving us the opportunity and the platform to talk about it. It means a lot, yeah. And also I would like to extend my thanks to the Center for Foreign Languages, Jindal Global University, and a special thanks goes to Dr. Shruti Jain, and of course, Anushka, Kushagra, thank you so much for your wonderful insights and your interest. And yeah, with these words, I would like to begin with my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen here, and just let me know if you all can see it. Okay, is it now then on the screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah, okay, so
you can actually start it, like turn it, start the presentation either with a little key that is actually hidden for me. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, so yeah. So here on the left hand side, you can see the poster. The poster is made by Kathe Kollwitz, 1923, and as part of the Socialist Working Class with Youth, and for Central German Youth Day in Leipzig, 1923-24. And afterwards, this poster has been widely used in demonstrations. And in this poster, you can see here this young person raising his hand and then uttering these three words, Nie wieder Krieg, in German language, which means not again, never again war. So with these words, I would like to show you the lead room that I will be talking about first. How do we understand violence, and what do we mean when we say words like conflict situations? My focus afterwards will be on discussing sexual violence against women in conflict situations in general. And then I will come to the point where I will be discussing a little bit briefly about sexual violence and the politics of its representation. And then, of course, I will be giving you a little background about the 1945 Berlin, and using the term Battle of Berlin. And towards the last point will be the witnessing and writing violence of 1945 in a diary, Anna Frau in Berlin, 1949. And here I will be talking basically how this text itself is a history, like since we are talking about the controversy around this text. And also the author decides to remain anonymous. So the German version has the title Eine Frau in Berlin, and then the name of the writer is Anna Neumann, and English title is A Woman in Berlin, and the name of the writer is anonymous. So I will be also showing you some quotes from the diary, and analyzing it through the lens of emotions, which is also broadly my research interest, study of emotions and literary studies, combining literary studies and emotion studies together. So my first point here is defining violence and conflict situation. So what is meant by the term violence? Winkler explains various concepts of violence, for instance, physical violence and harm through the act of omission. In these two concepts of violence, the what content is linked to the content of who. The who content designates the specific people, for example, the perpetrators and the victims, and who are sometimes known as, sometimes these who are known and sometimes these who are unknown. So the who content also includes culture-specific thoughts, patterns, and structures responsible for social inequality. Winkler further argues that striving for order through classification results in acts of violence because order becomes an obsession after a point. For example, he gives here an example of weed as considered as something which should be kept outside of the order if you are talking about the garden, and it should be pushed aside with the help of force. So I would like to read this quote here. Yeah, so weeds are the gardener's waste product. Poor streets become the waste of town planning. Dissidence is the waste of ideological unity. Heresy is the waste of orthodoxy. Strangeness is the waste of the establishment of the nation state. And all of this is waste, which defies classification and disturbs the cleanliness of the law. All of this is the non-permissible mixing of categories that are not allowed to mix. So in this context, we need to understand what is violence in order to preserve some kind of order or classification. So like Winkler, Wolfgang Sofsky 1996 also speaks of the interconnectedness between order and violence. And he says, I quote, violence creates chaos and order creates, again, violence. So Sofsky's argument that because of the experience of violence, people unite and thus societies are formed, wars also exists to restore some kind of order, and cultural and structural violence play a very significant role in it. An example of cultural violence from history is, for instance, Holocaust, since we're talking about here German studies, genocide, any genocide we can take as an example here, and other forms of physical violence on people made possible by anonymous structures. So structural violence has an anonymous structure in itself, and no one appears here who could directly harm another. So violence is built on the system and expressed in unequal power relations. So here I would also like to draw your attention towards the political violence and torture is how these two forms of violence is also part of the structural violence, which for example is continued by state, and which for example also destroys individuals and personalities and affects them. So referring to this violence, I would like to show you another quote and would like to read this. Politically motivated torture is amplified by the symbolic violence that trails in its wake, making those who were tortured feel shame for their weakness in betraying their comrade under duress. Rape survivors, especially those who are violated with genocidal or sadistic political intent during civil wars, often become living dead people, refusing to speak of the unspeakable, and are often shunned or outcasted by kin and community, and even by comrades and lovers, unquote. So the different forms of violence have these four W questions, and fourth W question is where, which means the conflict reason or the situation that is being created. And here the who is the woman who becomes the biggest victim, like Anushka and Kushagra also said in our introduction. So they are not only displaced, they are also the victims of different forms of violence, sexual assaults, and after once this ends, there is another form of violence which is inflicted on them, which is the violence of shaming and stigmatizing them, which makes the theme itself very problematic to talk about. So another question in this segment is also important. How do we define and segregate rape and sexual violence and various forms of other sexual violence to be separated from these forms of violence which I have talked about? So the word rape is a term related to violence and referred to the realm of sexuality and violence against sexuality, which robs a person of psychophysical integrity. Nor should rape be defined as a violent sexual act or as a mere expression of male aggression, but should be understood as psychophysical violence within the power of patriarchy. This definition emphasizes power within gender relations, and violence has less to do with sexuality and sex in the biological sense than with gender. Any androcentric perspective links rape to sexual acts and rape as an extreme form of sexual intercourse. In her essay, Fighting Bodies, Fighting Word, Sharon Marcus refutes this androcentric perspective, and she defines rape as follows. I quote, "For definitional purposes, however, rape is clearly neither sex nor simple assault. Rape could best be defined as the sexualized and gendered attack which imposes sexual differences along the lines of violence," unquote. Now I would like to here also read this quote, which I have here in the German language, but I have tried to simplify it, break it in English. So by Julia Shalom, she is also trying to explain rape and sexual violence against women from the perspective of the victim. And she says the sexual violence and rape carry an imminent threat of physical and psychological harm, and such experience of violence can change the person's interpersonal behavior. It can also give the person the feeling that the loss of control is there over the situation as well as over one's own body. And one can also feel one's own will as disregarded. And it has also the potential to destroy one's own idea of self. So, as a presenter today, I have used the established terminologies, and since we are talking about it, it is also very important which word we are selecting in order to talk about it. So here I have also used the established terminologies like rape and sexual violence, and also the word violation. Depending on context, these terminologies can also function in the favor of sexual terrorism. So what is sexual terrorism? It is a system of oppression or the culture of violence. And if we look and define sexual terrorism through the lens of intersectionality, we will also be able to see it and explain it, how daily and regularized nature of sexual violence is very much present there in the culture. Or from there, we can also have the term called rape culture, or the culture of violence against women in general. So this regularized violence is deeply rooted in our socialization processes, for instance, and is a cornerstone of patriarchy, according to this sexual terrorism. So it can also terrorize such vocabulary, such terminologies. But it is also very important to name all these violence. Otherwise, the choice of words becomes very important here in this specific context. And also other way around, when we choose not to use such terminologies, then women's experience remains unnamed. It remains dubious reality in the eyes of the others. And for example, before the naming of sexism, for instance, or sexual harassment, for instance, it was women's behavior that was seen as problematic and in need of explanations. That's why these terminologies are very important. The naming of violence, for instance, rape, sexual violence, is not random, therefore, and very much biased and context specific. By taking the power of also naming their experience for themselves, women can determine the nature of violence better. We can take that position. And this we will discuss with reference to the diary Eine Frau in Berlin, which is written from a woman's perspective, so to say, survivor's perspective. Now I come to the fact trigger warning. So whenever we encounter such narratives, be it literary text or be it any series, any film, or maybe from visual culture, something is coming up. So there is this word trigger warning which we always encounter. So what is it that makes triggering here? And when we are talking about trigger warning, there is one more word that is very important. If it triggers somebody, then this topic itself also becomes a taboo topic. And also it has been also observed that graphic and voyeuristic details dominate this entire discourse on sexual violence, and victims and survivors are also projected as object of lust. And the third very important point is there is complete absence of empathy for the victim. So if we are encountering all these 3-4 points where there is this form of violence being done on somebody, then of course it will trigger the recipient. So in that sense. So now I will shift my focus to the German context, from where this word has been and from where this comes into play. So I have chosen here from 1941 text Jakob Grimm. He talks about the name of the text is Über die Not an Frauen, and there he is talking about sexual violence and rape against women as something harming the honor of the person, honor of women. And in order to do so, a person can also harm the honor of the entire family and the community. That's how it was being seen at that point of time. And also, Grimm suggests in this particular text that such crimes must be punished severely so that it should not occur in the society. Now I will jump to the contemporary Germany. So what is the scenario here when we are talking about this specific topic? So Germany's parliament has recently passed a new law defining rape, clarifying that no means no, even if a victim did not fight back, earlier which was not the case. So under the previous law defined in section 177 of the criminal code, victims should have defended themselves for an act to constitute rape. Simply saying no was not sufficient to find the defendant guilty, and there was no attempt to define what constituted consent, for instance. They will take into account both physical and verbal cues now from the victim when assessing whether rape took place, meaning in theory that that saying no could prove a lack of consent and therefore rape. So how this new law comes here, in the wake of attacks on New Year's Eve in Cologne, which shocked Germany. Just a second. Entschuldigung. So the wave of attacks on New Year's Eve in Cologne shocked Germany. Though prosecutions have been minimal, and it was also disappointing to know once again assault could only be proven under German law if the victim resisted. So the attacks prompted a campaign for victims and also prompted campaigns for reform under the hashtag 9heist9. But the new law is also under criticism because this new law will not give adequate protection to victims who cannot clearly convey their lack of consent, such as those who have been drugged or under the influence of alcohol, for instance. So now I will come to the next point: sexual violence against women in conflict situations in general. So there are three categories here: wartime rape, a peacetime rape, and other deeply structured and symbolic violence against women. Three categories, and the third category, under third category, we have domestic violence or intimate partner violence, etc. So we are talking about here wartime rape. The sexual violence in the conflict situation can be classified under this category, and Berlin is the space. Since we are talking about 1945, so the space where sexual violence against women took place with the marching of the so-called liberators. So therefore, these spaces should be referred to as conflict regions. And there are historical examples, ample examples to see how these regions, conflict regions, becomes a battleground for rape and sexual violence against women as weapon of war. So Susan Braunmiller, in her famous text Against Our Will, Men, Women and Rape, 1975, says, I quote, rape was a weapon of terror as the German Hun marched through Belgium in World War I. Rape was a weapon of revenge as the Russian army marched to Berlin in World War II. And rape flourishes in warfare irrespective of nationality or geographic location. Rape goes out of hand, regrettably, as the foreign minister was later to say, when the Pakistani army battled Bangladesh. Rape reared its head as a way to relieve boredom as American GIs searched and destroyed in the highlands of Vietnam, unquote. For example, more than 200,000 Chinese, Filipino, Korean, and other colonized women were victims of systematic rape and violence in Japanese comfort situations during World War II. Or the widespread use of rape by US military forces during the Vietnam War. This again is is evidenced when looking at the ethnic cleansing that took place during the 1992 Bosnian conflict, 1994 Rwandan ethnic war, 1994-1996 Democratic Republic of Congo, where rape and forced impregnation were part of the military strategy. So more recently are the rape jihads occurring in parts of war-torn Africa and other places where women are abducted and raped in the name of religious conversion, for instance. So these examples illustrate how rape and sexual violence have been used as a strategic tool during military and wartime conflict, and the ways the civilians have become the collateral damage. So the German historian Miriam Gebhardt is of the opinion that the experience of such situations or spaces are always different for women, and she uses the word die Böse, which is you can see here, which means the evil. And another term that she uses is the böse Männer, evil men, for the male perpetrators. I will also give you an example of partition of North India, Indian subcontinent in 1947 from our context in order to understand this. So Veena Das also argues about it, and she argues that women's body are appropriated as a territory in our in the conflict situation of 1947, and yet the violence of the partition was unique in the metamorphosis it achieved between the idea of appropriating a territory as nation and appropriating the body of the women as territory. So Veena Das is using the word monsters in order to talk about the perpetrators. And while she is using it, she is analyzing the kidnapping and rape as the most brutal form of violence during the partition. For instance, tattooing the nationalist slogan on women's bodies and organizing and celebrating the mass procession of women being stripped by crowds, for instance, in cities like Amritsar and in Lahore. So such violence can be seen in the context of nationalism and communal violence carried out by the fanatics. So she's using the monster word for these fanatics. So my question here is, can we again see this specific kind of sexual violence against women as male aggression? If we look from that prism, then we can take these two words by Miriam Gebhardt and Veena Das into consideration. But here we are talking about basically the systemic structures which are responsible for such events and such violence against women, and we can see these crowds or these soldiers are the agents of such structures. So if we take into consideration, can soldiers be termed here as böse Männer or perpetrators as monsters? And if we agree, then the question starts, where do we put the particular structure, systems and institutions that form these monsters or die böse Männer? So I will leave this for you to think about it. And I will now shift my focus to the next point, where I will be briefly talking about the politics of representation of rape and sexual violence. So according to Roman mythology, Rome was founded in 753 BC, and one cannot forget the rape of Sabine women there, which is in the background of this founding. Susan Braunmüller again extensively refers to this specific event in her work and believes that there has never been a moment in history when rape of women in war times was viewed as a criminal act, but rather women were blamed. So the representations of the abductions of these women in the numerous works are proof that the artists treated the captured Sabine women as someone who is having a good time. So here she is using this poster also in her work, and this visual representation, this picture of the sculpture made by Giovanni Bologna in 1583 was termed by Braunmüller as heroic rape. And I have taken an example of the depiction of sexual violence having made by women like Käthe Kollwitz, which I will show you next. So when I was also going through the yesterday's poster of this lecture series, so in the background also I saw the painting, imprint of the painting by Picasso. And yeah, we can talk about it maybe later on. And I'm very curious whose idea was it, and when we are talking about sexual violence against women, why this particular painting came to your mind. So that would be my question to you. So now I will show you another picture by Kathy Kollwitz, and the title she uses is Raped, and here she emphasizes the aftermath of rape and psychological and visual perspective in order to evoke ethical and psychological empathy towards the victim. So in this particular picture, we can see that. And so now I will come to the conflict situation of 1945 and women, particularly Battle of Berlin. So here, these are the books that I have referred here, and along with my own article. So I will be reading a little portion from my article, and references are these books here. So the marching of the liberators or the Red Army to Berlin in 1945 was marked by large-scale death and loss, uprooting, displacement, and violence with the end of the Third Reich and World War II. At the time of its subjugation, Berlin witnessed power cuts, extreme scarcity of water and food supply, and looting, bartering, casualty, etc. Anthony Beaver states, for the last Jews left in captivity in Berlin, the coming of Red Army signified either the end of the dozen years of nightmare or execution at the last moment. Yeah, however, the liberation did not turn into emancipation from oppressive rule, as the Befreier or the liberator or the Soviet soldiers raped Jewish girls also and other women in the camp. Mass rapes had already started the moment the Red Army entered to Berlin on 23rd of April, Anthony Beaver writes. And he also writes, for example, in the neighborhood called Dahlem in Berlin, in a maternity clinic and orphanage, nuns, young girls, old women, pregnant women, and mothers who had just given birth were all raped without pity. Mass rapes in the Battle of Berlin was one such constructed event. For instance, anti-German propaganda within the Soviet army also encouraged the Soviet troops to take revenge and break rules against civilians. And according to Helga Zander, between 20,000 and 100,000 women in Berlin were raped. Cornelius Ryan writes in his book, The Last Battle, that every second woman in Berlin was raped by soldiers of the Red Army. Norman Naimark writes that the occupation of Germany was not also marked by the spread of venereal disease, which was also a plague on the population, and that from late 1945 till early 1946. The consumption of penicillin also increases during this time period, and he also states Soviet soldiers who committed rape were a major cause of the rapid spread of the disease in this particular zone. So these facts indicates mass rapes in the Soviet zone. However, mass rapes of women perpetrated by Allied forces or soldiers at this time was never a topic of discussion in East and West Germany later on. So it was only after reunification that the debate and discussion on this topic started. But the central question in this debate was whether 8th May 1945 should be observed as the day of the fall of the Berlin or as the day of liberation in true sense. So there has been silence actually for over 50 years on the mass rapes of women perpetrated by the liberators or the Red Army, and which has not been discussed in public and explored or researched also, although there are lots of diaries, newspaper articles written around it on this topic. And Helga Zander says this is the real scandal for the country. So now I will come to the diary, witnessing and writing violence in the diary. So diary has been written from the perspective, first person perspective, and here you can see the chronology of its publication. So 1954 first published the English translation, then comes the British edition, and after 1955, the ID was soon translated into other languages like Dutch, Danish, Italian, Japanese, Finnish, etc. 1959 comes the first publication of the original German by the Swiss publisher. 2003 republished and bestseller, and then 2005 a new English translation of the diary comes by Philip Bjorn is the translator, and 2008 is the film, directed by Mark Faber-Bjork. So this is the chronology of the publication. So I will here try to understand the controversy around it also through the publication history. So 2003 publication in Germany met with basically positive reviews. People said, the reviewer said, for instance, in Taggart Zeitung, that if you know how to read and write, you must read this text. And others, for instance, said, there is one quote from Der Spiegel that it actually is so moving narrative of the war. And 2005 publication, the British edition came. When the publication came in 2005, it was again had the all positive remarks by New York Times, Washington Post, etc. So the politics of anonymity is also connected with the controversy here. So if the diary was a success, is the main question here, abroad in 1955 and 1954, why was it not published in Germany until 5 years later is the main question here. So the author's name appeared as anonymous in English and anonyma in German, 59, and the author agreed to the publication of the new German edition only after her death and on condition that her anonymity be maintained. And she died in 2001, which led to the 2003 publication with her in a new edition. So after its publication in 1959, it actually sparked controversies, and these controversies were, how can you talk about it? And because it was also these subjects are taboo subjects, and survival, how can you survive such violence, are the few questions that was there in the controversy. So the negative review of the German 1959 has this title, for instance, Bad Service to Berlin's Women, Bestseller Abroad, A Distorting Anomaly. This was the title of the German review written in German language. And few months after its republication in 2003, a prominent journalist named Jens Bisky claimed that he had discovered the identity of the anonymous diarist, and he named her as Martha Hiller, who was a journalist during the time of National Socialism, and she published, wrote, and she had her livelihood, and she was also termed as somebody who was Nazi sympathizer at that time, but there was no authentic proof in order to say this clearly. And later on, the biographer of Martha Hiller, actually Clarissa Schnabel published her biography in 2015, and there are characters, and there she also makes a remark that names have been changed in the narrative, and she wanted to maintain her anonymous identity. That's why she change the names and names of people, names of streets, names of each and everything. Even her looks that she describes in the diary is something not the way she looks like. So in the main point here, Enzensberger actually writes in 2015 why this diary met with negative reviews 1959, because it asks people to face some uncomfortable truth, and also shameless mortality is there in the book, and that we will encounter later on. And there are positive remarks given by JAN-HELGE on the book, and but the controversy fails to acknowledge that the transformation of lived experiences into text always involves a subjective interpretation of past experiences, and this we can understand through the memory studies. So Anthony Beaver also takes into account that this diary is a very revealing piece of social history. It is very important to understand war from a victim's point of view, from a woman's perspective. And he also says this is the personal account. Then another review comes. This article comes in 2019, again questioning the authenticity of the diary. And the diary, the main manuscript of the diary was given to Institute für Zeitgeschichte in 2016. And afterwards, people have actually researched about it, whether this diary is an authentic piece or is this like not authentic. So truth claim and controversy is always attached. And this is the recent 2019 controversy. So there it has been said in this article that only 35% of the diary has been written during 1945 and rest is written after 45. So that was the statement given in this particular So now I come back to again to the politics of remain anonymous when we are talking about rape and sexual violence and lived experience of it, witnessing it. So I have borrowed few terms from this book by Lai Gilmore. The name of the book is also, the title of the book I find also very fascinating. It's a Tainted Witness, Why We Doubt What Women Say About Their Lives, 2017. So she uses the term tainted witness for witnesses like Anonyma here. And what are the things that make somebody a tainted witness? She says, to contaminate with doubt, stigmatized through association with gender and race, and dishonor through shame, such that not only the testimony, but the person herself is smeared and eventually becomes tainted witness. So why to stigmatize as tainted witness? Because through testimony, they seek to bear witness to inconvenient truth, which is also the case here with Anonyma. They possess less symbolic and material capital than man as witness in court of law, and because they are women. So I have also tried to deduct it like this. Choosing to be anonymous, whether means choosing to not stigmatized as tainted witness. Choosing to be anonymous also means against the process of shaming or survival instinct, so to say. Or choosing to be anonymous can also mean choosing to survive any form of further violence, for instance, the violence of stigmatization later on. So, and Kurt Weiss is also in his work writes about the focuses on the victim and how, and also tried to summarize the reasons that women are less likely to be believed when they talk about rape and sexual violence. And these are the points he actually points here. And the longer she waits before reporting the case, she is less likely to be believed. The less actively she resisted the assault, or the better she was acquainted with assailant, or the more doubtable her own reputation is, if she consumed alcohol prior to her assault, and if she had engaged in sex with her attacker before the rape. So these are the points there that makes women less likely to be believed. So in her famous book, Die Politik der Demütigung, the politics of humiliation, Uta Freiberg actually coins two words, Beschämungsopfer and Beschämungskultur. Like Beschämung is shaming and offer is victim. So one becomes the further victim of the process of shaming, and along with rape culture, there is the culture of shaming the victim or survivor of the sexual violence. And there she is talking about it. So I quote here, it's about shame. It silences the victim, prevents them from naming the perpetrators and bringing them to justice. It may seem surprising at first glance, but what should an abused woman whose honor and self-respect has been betrayed by be ashamed? Shouldn't she rather feel disgust, anger, and also expresses it? If one defines shame as a response to one's own misconduct, then it is indeed difficult to make sense of the victim's shame. After all, the attack was caused by third parties. They don't blame themselves. So I will skip this and come to the text. where she's talking about not about shame, like Uta Frevert says, but about other emotions. And what are these emotions? So in this quote, she's talking about three kinds of dreams. And I don't agree with the English translation of it, because she uses the terminologies like Wachtraum, Wunschtraum, and the third is Flugtraum. So Wachtraum is vaguely translated here as daydream, Wunschtraum is fantasy, and then Flugtraum has been translated as means to escape. So these are the three types of dreams she's talking about in order to escape the trauma which she is facing afterwards. So here the first person narrator narrates her own feeling. Petka, a Red Army soldier, raped her several times, and she narrates her daydream after the perpetrator, Petka, leaves. In the language of psychology, this comments by the first person narrator describes the trauma of sexual violence. She observes herself in the moment of daydreaming that signals towards her insomnia. Further, she observes her own body objectively, and there is a separation between body and soul here. This separation marks the first person narrator's attempt not to hold herself responsible for someone else's crime. This separation can also help her to continue with living. She compares herself to the angel, but to an angel without wings. As a result, she appreciates her existence. She also explicitly describes her emotional state by saying, I can still feel the sense of rising up and floating. Here the verb is feel, and adjectives are uplifting, floating, and the noun is gefühl or feeling. And these are the feeling words on the surface of the language. Explicitly expressed, and they are called Emotionswörter, words coming from the domain of emotions. So there is also an explicit display of self-determination here, because she uses the words like me twice, my twice, and I once, and they are written all over the text several times. The words from an extra terrestrial world like angel or luminous white being describes her desire to escape the reality. She speaks of different types of dreams, and only these dreams can save her when reality becomes unbearable. So all these three dreams express her strong desire to survive also. And she writes, I should not be my I to whom, it should not be my I to whom this happens, unquote. Her emotions are internally focalized here. That is the speaker's emotion, first person narrator's emotion. And she tries to separate her I from the body, from the reality, from the existence of an experience of sexual violence. And the adjectives towards the end, for instance, cool, heavy, and claim, cool, heavy, and calm are the adjectives or emotion words that articulate her feelings. Further, she is talking about a feeling of not feeling at all. She writes, all my feelings seem dead except for the drive to live. So in one sentence, you can see dead and live. These two words, opposite words, are written, and yes. So in the next quote also, we will see this feeling of not feeling anything. She writes, heart, hurt, love, desire are not foreign, and these are the distant sounds for her, and she cannot actually associate herself with all these emotions. Only all and feeling all wishes, hope begins with food. So if somebody is thinking on those lines, during the war-like situation, one cannot think of emotions or morality or ethics, but one can only think of food. So those affected and are victims of war, hunger, torture, and sexual violence are blamed and shamed by only those who are privileged and entitled. That is the mood here. That is the message here. And the survivors are shamed for surviving the war, and they are forced to choose later on anonymity to live their lives further. So the second example from the quote from the book actually makes the book controversial, where she writes, by no means it could be said that the major is raping me. One cold word and he would probably go his way and never come back. So this statement is very ambiguous, whether she is choosing to be with this person or whether it is a coercive situation, and her consent in this situation cannot be termed as consent, because in order to live her life, in order to survive, she is actually choosing this particular major to be with him and allowing him to violate her. So this is the debate around it, and this is also the debate that actually brings back the controversy related to it. So further, she uses the word Shendung or Shanda 3-4 times in the entire text, not the word Vergewaltigung, which is the word for rape, but of course the translation translates the word Shendung as rape here, and we can differ here. Why? Because European languages other than English has two kinds of shame. In German, for instance, there is Schande, which means disgrace, shame, which if we can translate it into English, and one is just shame or Scham, which means everyday shame. So Schande means disgrace, shame, and Schendung word means rape or disgrace, shaming, for instance. So in the diary, the author tends to avoid the word Vergewaltigung, which is rape, and uses the word Schendung, which means violation or disgrace, shaming. So she deliberately uses this terminology in order to talk about it. So now I come to the point where I want to discuss how she resists the process of shaming. So this is one quote, the first one, you all have, I quote, you all have turned into a bunch of shameless bitches. Every one of you in the building, don't you realize? Then this is the statement given by the person, the character Gerd, who appears towards the end in the diary, and he is somebody who returns from the front war zone to home, and where he sees these women having friendship with the enemy, so-called enemy or so-called Red Army. And when she gives him to read her diary, this is his reaction that she actually narrates further in the diary. So Ged is somebody who is the incarnation of the ideal of the gender ideal of fascist state, and fascist Männerstaat is the term that I have also written here. So how they have visualized it and how they actually see women in the fascist state, and that's how his reaction also justifies it. Then she also writes, he looked at me as if I were out of my mind, but said nothing more. So he actually, his gaze towards these women who survived the war is he's trying to diminish them, undermine them through his looks, that they are surviving, but on the cost of what? And there John Berger also writes, I quote, men survey women without before treating them. Consequently, how a woman appears to a man can determine how she will be treated. To acquire some control over this process, women must contain it and interiorize. So this is what Ananyuma is against it. She's not somebody who is trying to appear in order to be accepted. She's somebody giving her diary and then allowing him to confront the reality, what she has gone through. And here she also explains what is the real disgrace. So real disgrace is the cowardness of the people there in general, not being violated or being raped by the Red Army as victim or as survivors. That is not her emotion, but Shanda is not her emotion. Here the Shanda is for those men who have behaved like this. So in the first quote, you will see how other women are talking about their neighbors, men neighbors, and how they did not come forth to also protect them. So this such acts of cowardness actually defines in the diary that is the real Shanda. And another interesting fact here is also the diary writes the emotion of the perpetrator. So in the second quote, she's writing the emotion that the attacker is feeling after he is attacking the narrator. The man is smiling, and also she is documenting the emotion of the attacker. So here her emotion is the emotion of disgust over shame, and disgust is throughout the text that she articulates, and she says, I quote, if at least we had a little decent soap. I have this constant craving to give my skin a thorough scrub. I'm convinced it would make me feel a little cleaner in my soul as well, unquote. The second quote, I feel so dirty. I don't want to touch anything, at least of all my own skin, unquote. The third quote, I have this repulsive sense of being passed from hand to hand. I feel humiliated and insulted, degraded into a sexual thing, unquote. So this is her emotion. So further, disgust has been defined as a state of alarm and emergency, an acute crisis of self-assertion against an unestimable otherness, a cramp and struggle that is literally about to be or not to be. This is very existential, and she's struggling with this emotion within herself. So her expected emotion from her loved ones, from society in general, from people around her is Herzenswort and Seelenbrot. So Herzenswort has been translated as heartfelt word that she's expecting from people, and she's expecting a bread for Seele, which is in the Catholic Church, so to say in German, im christlichen Sinne. It has its own meaning. That is what she is craving for. So Sarah Ahmed writes, there is the relationship between love and shame. One can feel shame, which is not the case with Ananyuma here, the narrator here, but she's craving for love and empathy from her loved ones so that she can re-enter the family and the community again. So the next is also to have humor as a weapon against any kind of humiliation. She uses humor, and at points women are several passages are there where women are talking about their experience of violence, and she uses the expressions like a little female gossip, or she says with a wink. So they are actually talking about the sexual violence they have encountered, and as expected, they are not sharing their grim realities with some expected emotions, but humorous way is the way that they have adopted to talk about. And she also uses the expression like be gossiped, and also this was her way of taking revenge for if somebody has humiliated us for surviving, then humor is our reaction to them, and this is our way of telling them that we are not humiliated, we are not degraded, our identities are not being fixed around this particular incident. We talk about it, we gossip about it, and a little female gossip is something that also makes the diary controversial, because in reviews they also they have also written it's been written in the reviews that how can you talk about it in this particular manner. So humor works here as protection mechanism against humiliation, and humiliation creates a kind of claustrophobia, but it is a sense of being trapped, and humor is something that is helping her to come out of it. That's how we can understand it. And she's also taking stand against the word culture that we have talked earlier. So the existing language is not providing her appropriate words in order to talk about her experiences. So that's why you will see here lots of, in the diary, lots of use of neologism from the perspective of the victim. For instance, one neologism here is Keller Witz. Keller means basement. I've deliberately not translated it. Keller means basement and Witz is joke. So most of the time during when they heard that the Red Army is approaching towards Berlin, they hid themselves in the basements. So they, in the basements among women, they had the jokes. Would you like to have American, French, or would you prefer a Russian? So these are the content from the text. So this was among women, these were like their Keller wits. So, and in order to find it, she actually creates, using the compositor, she creates this word. Then comes the word Treppenschänder. So Treppen is, if you go inside the basement, you have to get down, and Schänder is somebody who is the perpetrator, who's the attacker. So most of the time what happened, her experience that she actually documents here, these soldiers came downstairs and they actually snatched young women, minors, whomsoever they could find, and took them outside in order to violate them. So she uses not the word perpetrator or any German translation of it, but she coins a particular word. Treppen means stairs, and Schänder, the perpetrator, who is connected with in her memory as Treppenschänder. And she is also using words like Zwangsverkehr. Zwangsverkehr actually exists, but for this word, she's using Schändungsbetrieb. Schändung is an occupation that they have taken upon in order to disgrace women. If you elaborate this word. So Schändungsbetrieb is another example of neologism. So this is also why she is coining it, because it is her refusal to the trope that sexual violence and the rape creates fate or the life further which is worse than death. And this is her way of dealing with it, her way of telling on the face that, okay, this is not my fate. So the emotion of survival is very much dominant there in the entire text. So these are the quotes where she actually explicitly talks about it. And why I have written emotion of survival. Survival is not an emotion. Actually, if you will try to find it in the lexicon of emotions, but the diary actually drives us towards it, that it should be categorized as an emotion in this specific context. If it is the dominant emotion, not the expected emotion, but the emotion that the victim or the survivor is feeling. So she says, I quote, "I only know that I want to survive against all sense and reason, just like an animal." So, yeah. So these are the front page of the books that I have referred here. First is the English. I have taken all the quotes from this. And here on the right hand side, you can see. And we can also talk about the cover of the book, since the writer's name is written anonymous or anonyma, which I find very interesting. And since we are talking about sexual violence against women and coming to the contemporary world, so I have just taken this screenshot of this article, and it is also the reality of our today's contemporary world. If we are talking about Ukraine-Russian war. And yeah, and I would like to end my presentation here with this quote from the book by Chanel Miller. She's the survivor of the Stanford sexual assault, and I have been following her because also that was the time period when I was also in the middle of writing my thesis. And yeah, the book comes later on, but this quote is also there in the victim impact statement, which got published online in 2015 and 16. And I quote, "And finally, to girls everywhere, I'm with you. On nights when you feel alone, I'm with you. When people doubt you or dismiss you, I'm with you. I fought every day for you. So never stop fighting. I believe you." A big, big knowing that you are important, unquestionable. You are untouchable, you are beautiful, you are to be valued, respected, undeniably, every minute of every day. You are powerful and nobody can take that away from you. To girls everywhere, I'm with you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your patience, your aufmerksamkeit, your attention. And yeah, over to the organizers, over to the moderators. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. We are clapping, which is silent, but you are seeing some of us, so it's at least somewhat visible. Thank you so much for this very, very nice talk. I particularly liked how you started on the theoretical aspects before moving on to the book. And I think that the shame of survivors, the stigmatization that they experience, the psychophysical violence, as you termed it, will make now for a very interesting discussion. I do want to, maybe before opening the floor to the questions from the audience, ask again about this very peculiar reception that the book had. I mean, I already just called it a novel. It is a diary. It is, as you rightly pointed out, it has been analyzed by, like, using the original source material by the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich to actually have been altered from its original written form in the early 1950s for publication, as you pointed out, changing the locations, changing some of the details to make it more anonymous. But in the end, it is a very timely document, so much so that Walter Kempowski, who you also mentioned, and maybe some of you know, Walter Kempowski wrote this, I don't know, 4,000-page work of Echolot, which is actually dealing with the original text published during the Third Reich and the Weimar Republic, and kaleidoscopically uniting them to give you really an image of history that you don't have anywhere else. Like, all history books, of course, write alongside this kind of pre-text that really is the historical text. But Kempowski, who is so steeped in, or who was, I should say, so steeped in the materials of the time, looking at this text saying it's authentic. Like, he immediately said, there's no question that this is authentic. And then in the end, the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich didn't disagree with him. I just want to go a little bit into the reception again after just going off this little particular track right now. As you mentioned, it was published first in the United States and then England, and then translated into various European languages. So we have a reception that is divided into, so to speak, non-German countries, West Germany and East Germany, the German Democratic Republic. How would you try to explain how it became so successful in the English-speaking and then various European languages world?
Yeah, the biographer also writes that she was being accused of somebody who had this anti-communist propaganda, and also in the Soviet zone. That's why the reception was not that much there, and that's why among the English speakers, they received the diary, and that politics is also there. And Miriam Gebhardt actually is the first historian who published her book Als die Soldaten kamen in 2015, which actually talks about the other zones where such incidents of sexual violence against women actually happened. And it was not just the Soviet zone, and she's talking about the French, British, Americans, everyone. So this is also very important to see what is the politics, how the politics is also undermining the debate in some zone, and how it comes into the surface because of some political reasons. And Norman Naimark also comments Stalin's remark on that, because the communist state that they wanted to have, that they had after the war. And when they wanted to discuss this, Naimark actually documents that one should not get into what happened. So this was more or less, I cannot quote from exactly what he meant, but this is what the meaning is there. And that was also the reason the Communist Party there actually wanted to take up the call to discuss this, but later on they were actually instructed that they cannot discuss about it because it has to do with the Red Army. And also Helga Zander, after her documentary film in 1992, the book also comes with the same name, The Liberators Takes Liberties, the English title is there. And there she actually says how from the other women, those who are talking about violence in the Soviet zone, specifically in Berlin, these narratives are also wrapped with racial comments, how they look like. They are the beasts, real beasts, their mongoloid faces. And it has also to do with the fascist propaganda against Russian as folk, Russian as people. So they are not of our standards. So when women are actually reporting about it, their narrative is also having those elements of racism. So yeah, that is what I would like to comment on your question. But it is a very larger debate why how in both the before the reunification in both the parts, how it was discussed is also another way to look at it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think your answer pointed out, I mean, it is a understandable position to take. Let's maybe disregard the racial bias that was there, but the problem of the Red Army raping women more than in the other occupation zones is seemingly just a fact, because also the German army was actually behaving much worse in what was then already the Soviet Union. And so they did fear retributions. There were mass suicides in many German villages and towns by families who were fearing for the arrival of the Soviet army. But still, it's a very stupid political perception. Why does this woman only write about the Soviet zone? She's in the Soviet zone. She cannot write about the American zone. So it's like my diary where I am in 4 different occupation zones. No, it's just the Soviet one. Yes, but very, yeah.
Being praised by, sorry to interrupt, it is also being praised by historians like Anthony Beaver, because he says she writes with lots of distance and objectivity, and which I have not mentioned in my presentation, how she writes about the entire episode of fascism. And there is one quote from the diary that unsere haben nichts anders drüben gemacht. Which means unsere is our soldiers. And when we talk about the German soldiers in Stalingrad, for instance, what they have done is not something different what the Red Army is doing right now. So she's holistically actually able to look at it like the universality of rape and sexual violence against women when we are talking about war and conflict reasons. So in the diary also it's been reflected. And also Dank dem Führer, and Dank dem Führer is the 3-4 times she actually writes this whom to thank all these miseries. And she is also pointing it out that the political scenario actually enabled brought all these miseries to not just to women, to people in general. Yeah.
It's a very complex book and story and everything. So thank you for making it so clear. Let me open the floor to anything that the audience would actually like to talk about. There was already one communication in the chat, namely from what I said before, that in the wake of the First World War, many Western countries gave voting rights to women. That is still correct. I stand by that. Switzerland is actually the early 1970s, I think 1972. But then the Swiss didn't fight in World War I. So if you look at the United States, the Netherlands, Germany, various other countries, they are all right there after the First World War. Liechtenstein is even later than Switzerland. That was in the 80s. That was in the mid 80s. So anyway, what can you say? Mountainous regions, very backward. Do we have questions from the audience? Otherwise, I can ask some. Or we can ask Shruti, we can forward the question that was asked of Shruti for selecting this particular picture in the background of the poster by Picasso.
I would love to answer that question, and thank you for taking notice. I, in fact, told Meher as well that I was very surprised by her noticing of the background picture of the other poster that I had made. And I'm very glad that you noticed this poster as well. In fact, you've also put the question to me. So good that you put the background of the poster, as in the historical, there is a historical significance of the motive of the rape of the Sabayan women. And as you had already mentioned, and this motive has been then also used by several other artists, not just Pablo Picasso. But what I find very interesting about Picasso's rendering of this motive is that he does not obviously treat rape as a heroic act. Yeah, and what he does here is clearly a critique through the filter of classical mythology. And this is his time. He's actually commenting on his contemporary times. He's obviously had the Napoleon Wars, the Nazi regime has passed by, and now what he sees just in his immediate context is also the Cold War between America and Russia. So this is very interesting how he projects the same characters in a different way. He has the horses there, two men, very barbaric and grotesque. The horses, their feet so big, the child almost as all insecure and helpless, and the mother along, showing that it's the mother and the children, so women and children, who are a collateral damage, as you had also mentioned in your analysis of the wartime rape and wartime violations of women and children. That's what it actually depicted to me, and that's why I chose that picture.
Yeah, thank you, Shruti. Yeah.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your analysis. We have read the text. In fact, Kushagra and Anushka also did a presentation on this text. They told us what the text was all about. The question, and this came up when JAN-HELGE also said, and I also mentioned novel, the term novel. The term, why would it be wrong to call it a novel, considering we have the Tagebuch of Anne Frank, for example, and we still treat it as a novel. And there is a certain plot, there is a certain movement in the plot, though these are just dates. I find it very, very, very beautiful, the way it actually goes beyond genres, all the Gattung, and it actually goes against the whole, the traditional genre. But still, I would like to, in fact, today we can actually call it a novel. Would you agree with me, or would you disagree with me?
I would agree with you, because I'm also looking at this text as a text which should be praised for its literariness. The text is quite rich in that sense. And also, when we are talking about the genre like diary, then we are also focusing on the documentary side of it, like to what extent it is documenting the factual details. And that is not something that I'm interested here. So for me, the text and its literariness is the most important thing. And also, I had this thing also in my mind, which I would like to also have your views on it. So how do we consider it? Like whether Beaver actually says it's a fine document when we are talking about the social history. Do we consider such texts as text so that we can talk about the historical construction, of a particular time and event? And memory studies actually keeps distance from this statement that such documents or such texts or such narratives must not be taken as something that we will, use it for the historical construction of the past events. So these are the tensions there when we are, getting into the Gatung of it. So the content itself, of course, is something that fascinates us, specifically when we are talking about this. So I would absolutely agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one thing. And then obviously, I mean, the second question that came to our minds, Anushka and Kushagra, you would agree. Please put your questions. You had so many observations. Please do share those with the expert we have. Please talk. Maybe I don't want to take your questions. Please, you do it. Yeah. But before one little thing, yeah, understanding war from a woman's perspective, right? The question of how a woman's perspective is different from a man's perspective. Have you ever thought about that?
Of course, yeah. So we do talk about women's writing, and since the title suggests the witnessing and experiencing violence, so I find the German word, the word coming from German language, erleben, is very important here. So experience, erfahren, and erleben, these are the two different, things. So what I consider is like the lived experience of something or somebody, of a person's lived experience, actually reflects in the narrative. And of course, if it is the lived experience of women, then it is going to be different for the writing is going to be different. For instance, which I have not mentioned here in my presentation, is also the solidarity among women. So which is in contrast to solidarity or the brotherhood which is there among soldiers. So which is two contrast thing to see. So when women are coming together, they are sharing their stories, and when men are coming together, they are violating the women there in the war. So these are the things also there in the text, which is very important to look at it from women's point of view. And we do understand and agree with the male gaze which is there. And also when we are talking about the voyeuristic details of the incident, so I would like to here give you an example of the film from Indian context, Bandit Queen. And there also, for the viewers, I would like to say that the film is being made by Shekhar Kapoor, and Arundhati Roy actually wrote a big article about it. Why for Shekhar Kapoor it becomes very important to have the long scene of rape scene of this particular woman, and who is still alive. And Shekhar Kapoor again comes to the media and then claims that he got the consent from herself, that in her life portrayal he can actually have that scene. So this debate is there, and I agree with Arundhati Roy's position where she is actually making a point that we need to talk about the unnamed, unknown structures which enables a violence like this, in not to focus on the incident of violence, for instance. And there she is talking about the male gaze of Shekhar Kapoor. And another example is the movie of 2019, Irreversible. It's a French movie, and there is a 9-minute rape scene in the movie, and it comes with the trigger warning. So as a viewer, you will feel distress watching this scene, and there are lots of articles also written about it, why this is 9-minute long scene, in one go, why you will have to see the show the victimhood, and what is the purpose of it. Is it like for the commodity? Is it why the graphic detailing of it so much there? So there also the male gaze is very much present. So of course, so when women write, they write differently. That's what I would like to say. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question? If that's all right. Okay, so in the context of the book, the author of the book being a journalist, she chose to remain anonymous. Why do you think she wanted to remain anonymous, other than the reasons that you mentioned, fear of stigmatization. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I can assume, what I, as a research scholar, what is the politics of being anonymous here, is one factor is very much dominant is the instinct of survival, and also not to fix your identity around it, not to be called as I am the rape victim or I am the survivor, because the one particular incident cannot define a person for lifelong. So that is one thing Martha Hiller in actually conveys to the biographer, not the biographer, sorry, in her cries to other women friends whom the biographer is talking later on. So there is no authentic source of it. Of course, she points it out in the biography, but we can never know for sure what was in her mind. But what we as research scholars, the way we can look at it, it enables her to survive. It enables her to see her as a person, who is not in favor of fixing her personality or identity around this particular incident, which is like more than this. And also, of course, the stigmatization is very much there, because if you will see the reviews that came in 1959, it also instructs somebody how to write about it, and she's not somebody who is agreeing with that. So there is no particular poetics of writing the violence. So when women are writing, they are just writing. When she's writing, she's just writing, whether it is questioning your idea of nation, whether it's questioning your idea of the regime, which was National Socialism. This is your problem. So yeah.
Maybe just to add, it's for closure. I mean, she was absolutely right from her point of view to ban the publication of the book in her lifetime in German again, simply because how can you get any kind of closure from the past when you're that much in the spotlight? I mean, so look at Indian victims of rape and how they are paraded through the media decades sometimes after it happened. I mean,
yes. And also she on one promise, she is allowing the republication in 2003 that we have here right now, and we are discussing it on one promise that her name will not appear on the cover. So what is our take on that? That would be my question to you all. So whether we are going to go with the Binsky text and call her as Martha Hiller, or whether we respect her wish and then use the word anonyma for the writer. So that would be my question to you all. Yeah, Professor Sami.
May I, JAN-HELGE?
yes, you may go ahead.
So I just agree totally with that. She does not wish to fix her identity, but there's another issue, I think, and that was the singularity. By naming her, what they've done is firstly violating a human contract, and secondly, trying to make out that this was a singular experience, which it wasn't. And I feel she was really justified in saying anonyma. She speaks for all those multitude of women who suffered that. She not only tells their story, she is that story, So I think that is also an important reason why it should remain anonyma, and rather than Martha Hiller's. And that's why the question of the Gattung is also very important, the genre, whether you can call it a roman or not. I find classificatory terms themselves are very problematic. After Christa Wolf wrote a number of texts which were autobiographical in nature, and she called them all roman. Even the last one, the Overcoat of Dr. Freud, she calls that also a roman, when we know that it is her and she's actually claiming it to be her, but she will still call it a roman. So no autobiographical text is anything but fiction. Like no fiction is anything but autobiography, in that way. So to classify texts, although I do teach poetics of genre, but I still think classification of texts is a very problematic issue in itself, But thank you, Pallavi. I thought you did a wonderful job.
Thank you so much, Madhu, and thank you so much for, for your inputs. It actually is a very good point here, like the singularity and how she actually gives voice to women at large. And towards the end, I have also given an example of Chanel Miller, Know My Name. And if you will follow her story, 2015, the victim impact statement comes out, and until that time, she is anonymous. And her name that she talks about it in her interviews in her book also, the internet, the media, the social media, and the journalists were after her identity, but she was guarded by the viewers, unknown viewers. So when they actually attempted to know her identity, which she did not wish to reveal at that time, 2015, she was guarded by unknown women on internet, which is like fantastic to know, which is like we have come to, the history is moving somewhere. That is what the feeling it can give. And later on, she decides to not remain anonymous also. And she comes in front of the media with her book in 2020, reveals her face, and she actually tells the world that here I am and you cannot fix my identity. And also it is an appeal that I will be talking about it, and my solidarity to other women is also there. So in that sense, so that is also there. If she's revealing her name, then she is also deciding that this incident cannot actually take her social media account away, for instance, the smallest thing, or Instagram account. She's not going to give that to also to her attacker. So that is what her statement is there. Yeah.
Aishwarya, you had your hand up earlier. Is there still a question in your heart?
I just wanted to add to this discussion taking place. Thank you, Pallavi, for that very interesting and sort of illuminating talk. I was just thinking about, the autonomy that women seek over their own narratives when they sort of demand to either be anonymous or not be anonymous. It's basically having control over your own narrative rather than having someone else, the society at large, or somebody else sort of take over control over your narrative. And I was just thinking in the Indian context, a very prominent anti-caste feminist, Meena Kandasamy, who's recently, in fact, even won a German award, if I'm not wrong. She has, she publicly spoke about her rape, and then she also wrote, a book which she, it's called When I Hit You, which she calls a memoir or autofiction. And she, so she's, but in the sort of media reception of her book, they began to call it autobiography. And then, she was really angry about it. She said, no, this is not autobiography. This is a fictitious account, with, and it's not really. So, so what I was trying to say here is that I think for women to be able to identify themselves as rape survivors also has something to say about the social world in which this, naming becomes possible, to somehow reduce or to challenge this whole narrative of shame that is associated with being identified as a rape survivor, and to actually make it something, less sort of charged and deeply conditioned as that. And I think that the Me Too movement, or whatever we saw in the fourth wave of what is now, I think, considered as part of the fourth wave of feminism, was a lot. I mean, there were discussions about this, but again here, the woman really has to have autonomy over her narrative. She has to decide that she wants to be named or not, and that, yeah. I think that at the time of Martha Miller, or the author of this diary must have been very, 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 very different from the time that we live in now. I don't think that these kinds of discussions would even have been possible, the kind that are now possible post-Me Too.
Yeah, and of course, maybe I can just interject that looking at the historical situation, the protagonists have died. The Nazis, that original generation, so to speak, are gone. There is now such a long distance, as it were, that you can like talk about these things without by activating the rapes that some German women experienced, obviously also activating the history of Nazism in Germany. Yeah, I mean, that's why this is an even worse complex, so to speak, because it's not just it's this woman's fault that she was raped, but here you have the Russian soldiers occupying a big part of the country. Why are they occupying the big part of the country? Like the complex of German guilt on the political level plays, you know, also a very big role in this shame that was, so to speak, preventing them from speaking out in the 50s. That is the only way to explain the backlash, really. Yeah, the restoration period in Germany in the 1950s and beginning of 60s, West Germany, I should add, was very repressive. And so we repress the past, we must repress the crimes that they committed, and we must repress thus the crimes that we committed. Okay, this is a good point. Maybe if there are no questions, that I get one question in, because I did want to ask about agency and the way that it is depicted in the text, because I think that is somewhat crucial, because calling it rape or a kind of forced prostitution, like looking also at Japanese occupation of Korea and China and the systems that they established there, one is kind of torn between all of these things. And in this one quote that you had, one of the last ones, where it was very clear, I'm sleeping with him kind of to get food. It's not really a rape. I could tell him to stop, but I just want the food. And that obviously then knowing how, you know, people in that generation that Martha Hiller, the author, was in, I know how this also feeds into this shaming response by German society at large. Like my grandparents are that generation. I have firsthand experience of people from that generation. And, you know, when people then would do something like that to have it a little bit easier, or maybe to be able to feed their children, or you know, escape a worse fate for maybe the husband that is sitting in the other room when the Russian soldier enters the apartment. I mean, it is taking up agency. Yeah, that one of the last quotes really brought it across. It is her regaining kind of a control over her life after this war situation turns into this occupation situation. And where do you stand on that? Because then that is kind of the crux of, you know, is it rape? Is it not rape? What is it? Yes, Pallavi, help me.
Yeah, so I would like to mention here another fictional narrative, The Handmaid's Tale. Anyone here read this? Okay, so there also it's a dystopian take on so many things, on the government, on the political scenario, and also the how to, you know, the reproductivity of women being, you know, channelized by the government and its forces. So dystopia in that sense that everything is now upside down, the political scenario, and how this character is actually negotiating with the perpetrator in order to survive, you know, that extreme situation. And the novel actually takes us to the extent that one can not imagine. Like so there also she has a child, and also born from rape, and not with consent, and that is also the part of her plan. So she's an acting character. Here also I see Ananyuma as somebody who is taking leads, or trying to take leads everywhere. She's also trying to make use of her little bit of Russian, so that she can, this quote is also very important, that she can actually have friendship with one wolf in order to survive the, you know, the war in general, and being violated by so many other, it's better to being choose one. So extreme situations, and then in her mind, she's negotiating. So how women actually negotiate is very interesting thing to see here. And I would like to mention another text where the extreme situation is there. I don't know if you have heard about Emericatus. He also received the Nobel Prize, and he also says that it is semi-autobiography, his text about his experience of Holocaust, surviving Holocaust. And when he was in the concentration camp, he was just 14 years old. And in one paragraph, he in his writing, he explains how he actually slept with one person who already died, in order to get his share of bread and soup, whatever he was getting. So for 3 days, actually, he gave the impression that the other person is unwell, so he can get his share of food also, and which is like really extreme condition. And then later on he reflects back, because later on he writes about it, and he says, now I'm able to see that I should not be ashamed of that, because that shame was very much their survivor's shame, I would like to term it. And then he actually talks about it. So yeah, in that context, I would like to also see Anonyma and her negotiation with people around her. Yeah.
Makes perfect sense. And also, you don't have to categorize the events, so to speak, or the deeds that are, being perpetrated, because that may be part of the male gaze that, needing to define the word it's just in the end irrelevant. Yeah, because we get the complexity of the situation. The organizer of the event series is having her hand up. Shruti.
I wanted to add to this, and then of course I see Ananya, she's raised her hand for a long time. You spoke about how she uses Russian, her little knowledge of Russian, and that I thought, even during our discussion became an important point, because that actually helps her to negotiate her way through the kind of chaos that she finds herself in. And then also the way she expresses herself while writing, we also noticed the way there is a change in the style of writing, right from the first time she's raped to the next few other times, till she actually says that I'm not going to do this and I need to find a solution. So the first time it is very subtle. You just barely, while reading, if you were a fast reader, you would actually miss out the point that she's actually been raped, and not just once, but many times. The second time it becomes more clear. The third time, there is actually this whole scene that she depicts where the man even spits into her face. That, I think, as you just rightly said, there is some kind of writing, and that, the writing becomes somehow a tool. And this diary keeping, why is she writing a Tagebuch after all? Maybe that question needs to also be addressed. How would you see this through your lens of emotions, for example? What is the role that the Tagebuch plays? Why is she writing it? And this actually, then I've seen, we noticed that there is a difference there. The language changes, the way she's talking about things change. There is some kind of a freedom. Is she trying to free herself from something? What is it that she's trying to achieve?
Yeah, so there's one term that I have also encountered during my research, which is called scriptotherapy, and which comes very much there when I was reading about Anna Frau in Berlin, whether we can actually look at it from that lens of scriptotherapy, like trying to heal herself every day on everyday basis after the incident happens, and she's trying to write about it, reflect about it. And also you will see like you have rightly pointed it out, like the variations, like first time happens, second time happens, and she's also writing about other people around her, how they react to this, like and then she's choosing not to give them names. They are just the characters. For instance, there is one character, that's why it's a novel, okay, Die Witwe, Der Major. So these are the not actual names, and these are the characters that's how she gives them name. So this is also important, and yeah, I would also agree with that, but we have our reservations when we talk about therapy these days in the contemporary world, because it's again very loaded word. So I would rather go with the word healing and her way of processing it, and also trying to heal on everyday basis. So and also after a point you will see in the diary there is a distance from herself, and her focus is also on other women, and her focus is also how women among themselves are talking about it. So when she meets her friend Ilza, for instance, she asks how many times, just the question, and she says from Mayor bis train ich muss hoch dienen, something like that, the quote is in German. So it's the symbolic language that women actually uses, and they are using at this time period, and she's reflecting on it, because these are the moments that she's alive when she's talking about it, when she's sharing it with other women. And like Madhu also said that it is not her story only, this is a story of everyone around her, and that also gives her a kind of comfort that everyone around me is actually able to understand what I'm going through, except the person who is supposed to understand, like the man in her life, Gerd, who is unable to grasp it. And Ilza also makes fun of her husband. She's also in the text says he's having complex. The moment I have started seeing Russian soldiers, he is also having complex, and then I had to tell him that don't find yourself in a bad position. They're not good at all when it comes to erotics. So these are the things that she is actually mentioned in the text. So I think that is her mechanism in order to overcome it. And humor, that's why becomes very important. And there is one text that if Anushka or Kushagra, you all are interested in, if you are looking at it, this diary from the point of emotions, then humor becomes very important. And Henry Bergson actually writes text on humors, on comic, why it is important. And there is another text by Kristeva, Powers of Horror. So what the horror does to human beings is something that is very remarkable. And she's also trying to figure out not to lose herself, in the middle of this entire horror. So in order to restore herself, reintegrate herself, not to be, delusional all the time, which she's writing that she is, that is her survival mechanism, bringing her again back to life. Yeah, that is what it is. Yeah.
Thank you, Shruti, for pointing out that Ananya has had her hand up for half an hour. Please, Ananya.
Yeah, I hope I'm audible. I just
Yes, you are.
wanted to add to what Professor Pallavi was saying about agency and where rape begins and where women's agency in bargaining ends. And I just wanted to add to that by saying that women's choices are very much shaped by the social situation that they're put in. And she rightly pointed out that The Handmaid's Tale is a very good example of that, because just because they had no other option but to choose being enslaved or sexually exploited doesn't make it their choice or consensual. And I feel calling such situations where a woman gives in due to their circumstances, because the circumstances are such that they're at a disadvantage automatically, and they lose their agency as a consequence of that, and then consider taking advantage of their situation, and then looking at that as not rape would be a very male centric view of what rape is. And I wouldn't personally agree with that as well. I had a question as well about historical sources, because I think I heard someone mention something during the talk about it not being a valid source to construct history, because I was just confused about that, because in India, for example, with regards to partition violence, we even use actual this was obviously a journal and diary a diary writing sort of thing, but in India we use even actual fictional literature to construct history surrounding partition. So even fictional literature that's written by men like Manto, for example, is used like as a valid like historical source to like construct history. So like what would like be the German understanding of that?
That is the question for the German on screen.
Either
I
it works,
yes,
I
I mean,
think.
I can start. I do take your point about it being a moot point whether it's rape or forced prostitution or whatever, because in the end that is just I get it. It doesn't make sense to ask the question even that way. As to the reconstruction of history, I think Shruti said it earlier today. It is problematic that aesthetic media have a much greater power over us than boring textbooks. It is just a problem. When Prince Philip died, Buckingham Palace had really big problems with the British press because they all wanted to show the Crown excerpts instead of using historical footage of Prince Philip, because that is in black and white and very grainy and very old. And that's not Prince Philip. We know how he looks. We've seen the Crown. And so a lot of British TV stations aired a fictional, like, cutting together of big events in Prince Philip's life from the fictional series. So I think that this is really a problem that we really want it to be interesting in order to get into the topic. And then, of course, with sound and rich visuals and interesting narratives that are obviously, cut and created in a particular way to keep us interested, fiction is more powerful than history. In Germany, we do read, for example, the Diary of Anne Frank and actually fictional works on the Third Reich in school, usually not beyond 10th grade, I would say. Because at that point, or maybe even 8th grade, because that is really like children's literature. Yeah, you get in Germany, this part of children's literature. Think Jojo Rabbit and this kind of thing, or when Hitler stole Pink Rabbit. I mean, there is a whole number of books that are then read in all German schools to expose younger readers, and by younger I mean under the age of, let's say, 12, 14, to German history. But as you rightly said, and maybe you saw me smile when you said it in India, it's not a problem at all to look at fictional texts to understand history. And from the German perspective, that is a very big problem because it doesn't work that way. I have seen the movie Downfall. It really doesn't tell me anything historically accurate. I have seen the movie The Lives of Others. That is my personal problem child, because that movie is taking place on Mars. It is not taking place in East Germany. The movie The Lives of Others, which maybe some of you have seen, is taking place on a different planet or in a parallel universe or something like this. So there is, as you can hear from me, there's a very strong feeling that fiction maybe gets you interested. And again, from a foreign perspective or an outsider's perspective, it's clearly a good way in. But in the end, to understand history, you would never look at literature, because again, this diary was in that sense rewritten or altered or whatever for publication. And that is always then a problem. It's not an authentic diary. Like you could argue Anne Frank's diary, you could argue a little bit either way, but she also wrote it for keeping a memory for future generations. So you could even argue that is not an authentic diary that you write and think nobody will ever read. So you speak absolutely truly. Yeah, I mean, that is the problem with the diary format. And so maybe it's good to call it a somewhat fictional text at all times. Does that answer your question, Ananya? Sorry.
Yeah, it did.
Just
It was
making
like
sure.
very
Just
helpful.
making sure.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Do we have more? Let me see. There is a little security. There is a message, but I can't find it. Yes, there it is. Chat. Thank you all. Okay, Aishwarya is just thanking us. Pallavi, do you want to add something more clear and concise than what I just said?
I just wanted to add just one thing. The perspective becomes very important. So from whose perspective what is being explained? So that's why we talked about the women's perspective when we talked about this particular text and this particular incident, how actually women are talking about it. And of course, we have historians here. So if you will see the documentary by Helga Zander, there are 16 women. They are coming in front of the camera and they are narrating their story. And towards the end, there is one woman who is not showing her face. She's under the shadow, and she actually narrates her story. So the individuals, they are deciding how they are going to talk about it, you know, how they are going to appear to the world, whether they are going to show their actual faces, their identity, and whether they really don't want to do it. So I think everything is there in Helga Zander's documentary that came. And yeah, for me, these choices become very important. And also in connection to Aishwarya's remark on that, that how women actually control over their narrative is also very important in this specific context. But of course, when we are talking about history in general, then this might not apply, you know. Yeah.
Perfect. I think in terms of timing, we are closer to the end than we were 2 hours ago. Thank you very much again, Pallavi, for giving this really, really insightful presentation and talk and discussion on this book, which obviously opens perspectives also on many other similar situations, whether it's war, occupied zone, civil war. I mean, so much is going on in the world. It was very great to have you here from so far away as Assam. Yeah, I mean, that is another thing why we are doing this particular series, to bring together researchers from wherever they may be, and not just, you know, looking at certain departments. I would like to extend my thanks also to all members in the audience. We still have some of you. We did lose some people, but we still have 23 people here. Thank you for coming this week. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there will be a break at some point, but next week we still have, right?
Yes, Kushagra, yeah. and Anushka will tell you about that right away.
Okay.
I give it back to the student anchors.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pallavi, for this insightful lecture. I think what stuck with me the most was how you discussed that women were used as weapon of war and as tools to humiliate the nation after a war, and how they were just used to claim. So this brings us to the end of our guest lecture today, and I hope everyone enjoyed the lecture just as we did, and it found it to be really informative. We thank everyone who attended the guest lecture and hope that we see you next Monday. The guest lecture will be delivered by Dr. Annu Pandey, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Germanic Studies at EFLU Hyderabad, as a speaker about writing for mice, post-human, post-gender, and ecography in Marlene Haushofer's The War. Dr. Alexander Phillips, who is an Assistant Professor at Ashoka University, will be chairing the session. And the flyer for the next lecture in the series has already been sent out in the chat, so that all of you have an idea what we will be discussing in the next lecture. Thank you, everyone, once again. See you next week. Kushagra, did you share? Yeah, it's there.
Yeah, it's there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both the anchors. Thank you so much, all of you, for having joined us. And thank you so much to Pallavi. It was excellent, excellent, excellent. Really, really enjoyed the presentation, the discussion. And thank you, JAN-HELGE, for being there. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, organizers. Thank you.
See you soon.